Well, we've been following quite closely, as you can imagine, this Moscow massacre, this horrendous terror attack. The death toll is at least 133 at the minute, more than 150 people injured. Absolutely horrendous. Moscow has said that it has arrested all 4 gunmen suspected of carrying out this massacre at a concert hall near Moscow. Putin has pledged to track down and punish those behind the attack. Now, Islamic State has claimed responsibility for Friday's bloody rampage, but there were indications that Russia was pursuing a Ukrainian link, despite emphatic denials from Ukrainian officials that Kyiv had anything to do with it. So what's the truth here? As always, when anything happens in Russia, you've always got to slightly question the version of events you're told, and no person better to do that than Mary Dejevsky, who's a foreign affairs columnist with The Independent. Mary, thank you for joining me this morning. What do you think has actually happened here, apart from, I mean, we know the facts. We know that there's been a bloody horrendous rampage. 133 people at least have been killed, with 150 injured. In terms of responsibility, in terms of the facts around it, what do you think is right?
This is one of the most complicated, potentially the most deceptive sets of claims and counterclaims that I can remember for a long time. Because if you were Russian and you were looking at this sort of attack inside Russia on mostly young Russians at a concert, you would possibly have 2 thoughts. One of them is that it's very much in the pattern, not just of ISIS, who have apparently claimed responsibility. It's in the pattern of previous attacks 20 or so years ago in Russia by Chechen separatists. And so that would be one area where a lot of Russians would sort of look and say, this is where we think the blame is likely to lie. The other, of course, given that there's a war going on between Russia and Ukraine, you say, well, who would want to kill a lot of Russians at one time? And that would probably be Ukraine. Now, one of the things that I found very, very interesting about the first few hours after the attack was that there were almost immediate disclaimers from the United States, and we've had another one today from the National Security Council in Washington, and from Kiev, from President Zelensky himself, who said this has absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine. And at the same time, of course, we had this this admission of responsibility from some group of Islamic State.
I want to ask you more about that in a moment, but just continue your thought on that one.
Okay. What I think is so interesting is that the conclusion that many people would immediately jump to, that there had to be some Ukrainian involvement, was immediately really thrown out. And it was done, it seemed to me, for 2 reasons. One of them because there were obvious fears that Russia could use this as a pretext for escalating the war on Ukraine. And the other is that if there were demonstrated to be a Ukrainian connection, it could alienate Western opinion, because this is a mass attack on completely innocent and uninvolved people. So that those were the first things that I thought. But the other thing was that I know sort of on your news, there's been criticism of the time it took President Putin to respond. Now, it didn't seem to me that it was less than 24 hours, and he gave a video address to the nation. And it did seem to me maybe that he was actually trying to find out what had gone wrong and was waiting in the hope that he'd be able to say that the culprits or the presumed, the suspects had been caught. And indeed, he was able to do that. But one of the other things that really struck me about Putin's address, which was 5 minutes, was that although he hinted in some ways that there might be a Ukrainian connection, in the sense that he said the 4 suspects were apprehended driving in the direction of Ukraine, and that there was some sort of agreement that they could be let across the border. I had expected that if there were a direct link to Ukraine, Putin would make a great deal of it.
Yes.
And he really didn't. Putin can get very, very angry.
He could make a lot of political capital out of blaming Ukraine if Ukraine were to blame, but he didn't do that. So that leads you to the conclusion that they're not.
Which is, it just seemed to me that he was more restrained than I would have expected.
Yes.
If there was an absolutely demonstrated Ukrainian connection.
Fascinating.
So, this leaves so much open.
Let's talk a little bit about Islamic State in Russia, because there are all sorts of, I've been reading quite a lot about the origins, about the, what is Islamic State in Russia? Because we don't often associate Islamic State with being in Russia. Obviously, there's the Syria connection and so on, but tell us, just illuminate that issue for us, Mary.
Well, I think it's probably true to say that there are affiliates and loosely connected groups that claim an association with Islamic State, because that's the sort of the dominant brand, if you like. And those exist in Russia as well, primarily in Muslim areas of Russia, especially in the North Caucasus. That includes Chechnya, and it includes the regions that abut Chechnya. And one sort of extremely speculative thought that I had, which might connect some of the dots that are out there, is that there's been quite a lot of resentment in some parts of Russia, especially ethnic minority parts of Russia, including less Chechnya, but some of the areas around. They have the impression, and they may be right, that a disproportionate number of their young men are being drafted to serve in Ukraine. And there are reasons for this, in fact, which may not be benign reasons. That these tend to be poorer areas, that the incentives for joining up at the moment, the pay is very good compared with your average Russian pay. And so, there are reasons why there may be more people being either volunteering or being drafted from there than from other regions of Russia. But it has fueled some resentment. So you could see that maybe that would fuel, if not outright Islamic State, then a desire to oppose the Russian authorities and to create this sort of havoc. But it's the gun attack and the way they used that they set the place on fire at the concert hall outside Moscow, that has the impression of it. That gives the impression of a carefully planned operation.
And it reminds us of the Bataclan.
That was just done on the spur of the moment.
It reminds us of the Bataclan attack as well in Paris a few years ago as well. There seemed to be sort of parallels there as well, certainly in methods and so on. So if we take this at face value, which I know we're both reluctant to do, but if we take this at face value and say, right, there were 4 people who perpetrated this, the suspects have been apprehended in Russia, they're caught, great, let's all move on. This is terrible. Obviously, there are huge, there's a national day of mourning. There are all sorts of shrines and tributes being paid to those who have died. But and that's correct, absolutely correct. But essentially, this is done and dusted. Do people just move on? I just wonder what political, geopolitical implications might come next, Mary.
Well, I think that there is a big question, I think, that would be being considered both around the world, but especially in the Kremlin. What effect is this going to have? And it's not just the effect of, if some link with Ukraine is solidified, then that may have one effect. It may encourage mobilization, more Russians to fight in Ukraine. It would certainly exacerbate tensions, and it might encourage Russia to escalate the war. If there is no, if the mooted connection with Ukraine doesn't go any further than we see it at the moment, then you can imagine that there may be a sense of insecurity in Russia, that it becomes more fragile, because these sort of attacks were not exactly commonplace, but they happened in the early 2000s, at the beginning of Putin's time in power. Chechen atrocities similar to this, even a theatre siege in Moscow, where a similar number of people were killed, happened in 2002. That if you could return to that degree where you've got people really on edge, and given that one of Putin's great selling points in Russia is that he's made the country and made Russians feel more secure than they were when he took power and than they were in the early years of his power. Now, if he's starting to lose that, okay, he's just been re-elected with a huge majority. However, however you look at the way this election was conducted and the fairness of it and everything, he has, in the eyes of most Russians, a convincing mandate. But if there start to be more attacks of this sort, and even just this one attack, that undermines a degree of his credibility. And if Russians start to feel feel less secure, then you can't predict the sort of mood inside Russia.